G'day guys, hope everyone's having a great weekend. So today I'll talk about tides. So we're going to talk about what tides are better to fish on, what tides may benefit you, what tides may poorly influence you, and how you can go about fishing at the best times for your fishing. So it's going to be just a quick little video to check into that and hopefully get a tip or two out of it. So firstly, most people know that tide's basically just the movement of water. So obviously high tide is where movement of the water comes into the estuaries and rivers, and low tide is where the movement of water is going out of the estuaries, out towards the oceans. So that influences fish feeding times, typically for a lot of different species. So I'll talk more about the species in saltwater today, just because that's what I fish consistently and that's what I know. I don't know much about freshwater and how the tides influence that, but I sometimes dabble in a bit of bass fishing, but at that same time, that's more just within my local river now. I fish in the Hawkesbury, so it's not like I fish many freshwater lakes and dams and things like that. So I'll stay strictly away from that. And even I know some dams don't have tidal systems at all, so that's something I won't mention within the video. But let's dig into it a little bit and see how we go. So let's talk about firstly the low tide and what that might be better for fishing. So low tide, like I said before, is where the water runs out of the system towards the ocean and where the water gets quite shallow if you're fishing in low amounts of water. So that's, for example, off river edges, off sand flats, things like that. So I find low tide quite a good time to fish when you're looking for species such as whiting or flathead, just because with that, let's say if you're fishing land-based, for instance, you can walk onto the sand and you can probably get access to parts of water you're not normally able to access, because you can walk a lot further out towards maybe where the deeper water is, and you can access a lot of different areas by foot. So that's quite handy. With low tide or on the run out tide, you can also go to the deeper water or where the water was holding on a high tide, and you can be fishing for when those flathead and those whiting and brim move out of the deeper water, and when the water starts to shallow down, they'll start to move away from that, so you can try and pick up fish while they're moving out of those deeper water systems. So that's one way I like to go fishing about it. So the negative of fishing the low tide basically is if you're fishing off the shore, you've only got so much access to certain spots. So for instance, if you have a body of water that's getting a lot shallower, those fish will probably move to the deeper areas, or might move towards boat moorings or wharves or jetties, things like that, and move away from that water. Also, because there is a lower amount of physical water where you're now fishing, that might limit the amount of your catches. So that's what I'd probably say about low tide fishing. So like I mentioned briefly, run out tide is basically where that water's moving from the deeper water and it's currently moving out towards the ocean from the rivers and tributaries. So with that, like I said, flathead are awesome to target, whiting, brim, those species that are moving out towards the deeper water from the shallower stuff that was there before. That's a nice way of targeting it. So let's talk about fishing the high tide. So the high tide for me is probably my favorite time to fish, just because it maximizes the areas that you can fish. So let's say, for example, you're fishing off the shore, the water will fill up, so you have more area to fish in, and you can put more casts in. Typically, a lot of the fish, such as even your brim and flathead, will come right up close to the shore in the warmer months, and you can access way more spots. So that's a nice way to go about it. Also, the other fact, on the high tide, you have species such as jewfish are more active because they're known as the Homer Simpson of the fish sort of breed, just because they like to move around and hunt when the water current's low. So in terms of energy conservation, because there is so little water current, they can swim around much easier without expending so much energy. So that's a good thing to think about. That's similar on the low tide, but then again, like I mentioned before, on the high tide, you have more, I guess, areas to fish and more things to play around with. So that's my probably 10 cents there. So lastly, let's mention the run-in tide. So the run-in tide is basically where that water's starting to fill in and where that water's starting to come into the shallower areas. So that for me is an awesome fishing time for brim in particular, and also I've fished for bass also in the fresh water. I know I'd say I'd only mention it a little bit, but it seems like that just gets the fish on the bite. So My best catches have been on sessions where the running tide's starting to fire, specifically on a high tide for brim, and whatever tide whatever moon cycle for bass. I find on the running tide it definitely helps with my catches. So that's probably my 10 cents there. Firstly, before you go fishing, look at the area you're fishing. Are you fishing in a sand flat, and is the low tide going to be something that's going to limit the amount of catches? Are you fishing in a really deep system, so it doesn't really matter what the tide is necessarily doing? Is it a high tide, so you're going to have low water movement, so the fish are going to be probably more active? Is it a dead low tide? Is it a run in? Do you want to try and target more bass or brim? Is it a run out? Do you want to try and target the flathead? So I guess you have to have that in mind when you are fishing. You don't want to just go to the river and then assess it while you're there. You probably want to do maybe 10 minutes, 20 minutes of research, have a look at what the tidal movements are, have a look at the moon charts if you're really into that, and I guess just preparing. And like a lot of people say, if you're not preparing, you're probably preparing to fail. So you want to try and just do, your quick little bit of looking up and, start targeting fishing from there. Because the last thing you want to do is, in your spare time where you could be watching the cricket or watching the footy, is going fishing, catching jackall. I know it's good to sometimes be in an environment and soak it all in, which is great. But at the same time, if we're fishing, we obviously want to catch. So let's try and maximize your catches by doing that. So as always, you can catch me at Billy_Troy_fishing. That's on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. I've got a couple of videos on there, so check those out. And I hope you have a great week and keep on fishing hard and keep on catching them. Cheers.